Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to episode 524 for March 5th, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Well, Brendan. It's as if nothing's changed. It's just you and I again.
The old format has returned.
You know, I did think about this earlier that if anyone is just tuning in for the first time, you know, after we made the announcement or before we made the announcement, rather.
Right.
They'll think nothing has changed. Like, oh, they're just doing video now.
I mean, we are the same people still, so emotionally nothing has really changed, though, right?
Yeah, of course. The format and the structure of the show is wildly different. I hope everyone is enjoying it. This week, it just worked out that Ryan could not be here.
Right.
And Jay, who was supposed to be here, fell ill earlier today.
Yeah, unfortunately.
So he could not be here. So it is just Brendan and I carrying the load like the good old days.
just JD and I playing the game. We're playing the sport here.
Exactly. Well, before we get into this week's content here, we're going to be talking about our top 5 sports movies inspired by Creed 3 that hit theaters over the weekend. We're going to be talking about our favorite sports movies, which is interesting because this is a list that we have already done on the show all the way back in 2013.
You have already done.
I've already done. Yeah. We as InSession Film have already done.
Yeah, fair enough.
It was episode 8 back in 2013. It was the third top 5 list, back then top 3 list that we had ever done on the show. It was the third time we had ever done it. Talked about our favorite sports movies. I'm not exactly sure what inspired that list, if I'm being perfectly honest, but
I'm not sure.
Here we are. We figured, you know what? It's been 10 years. Why not revisit this topic and talk about our favorite sports movies with Creed 3 out in theaters. And we do have a review of Creed 3. It's already up now on the YouTube channel and, of course, on the podcast feed. You can go and check that out. Before we get into it, though, I want to tell a little story here up front, Brendan. And this is sports related, so it is appropriate.
Nothing's changed. You've done this many times in the old format, too. Open up with something sports story related. We're going full circle once again, man.
Absolutely. And this is something that I experienced, something I witnessed over the weekend that I thought was really, really exciting. So as many of you know, I'm a big hockey fan.
Yep.
And I was watching some college hockey, the good old collegiate hockey. My Michigan Wolverines were playing the Wisconsin Badgers in the first round of the Big Ten tournament. And it was a really exciting game, goes back and forth. Michigan was a little lucky to be in it, but they go to overtime. Okay.
Yeah.
The game goes into overtime. Let me tell you about this kid, Stephen Holtz. He's a young kid at the University of Michigan, high prospect, you know, really touted young player.
Okay.
Earlier in the fall, though, he gets really sick, like almost dies in the hospital sick. Like it was dire. Like it was real bad.
Do you know what it was?
It was some sort of adenovirus, which, according to my doctor wife, is normal. But there was something about this strain of virus that was a little potent because it did put not just him, but 5 of the hockey players in the hospital ultimately.
Wow.
So it was
5 of his teammates specifically, you're saying, right?
His teammates, his teammates. So it was going around the locker room. So
gotcha. Okay.
So it was, you know, a more potent version of that virus.
Dang.
And he was the only one to experience extreme symptoms of memory loss, for example.
Oh my
and other
goodness.
things. And it was so bad they had to put him in a coma. They had to put him in a medically induced coma.
Yeah.
and they weren't sure if he was going to survive. It was that serious that it almost killed him. So, long story short, thankfully he recovers.
Yeah.
He starts rehabbing, starts getting himself mentally and emotionally back to normalcy.
Good.
And over weeks and months, he even starts skating and starts getting back on the ice, to the point where the doctors finally cleared him to go and play. He can join his teammates and go back and play on the ice. Months later, circle back to this game. It is overtime in the Big Ten tournament, and guess who scores the overtime winner? Stephen Holtz. His first ever collegiate hockey goal is a huge one. It is an overtime winner, and it is the stuff of movies.
I was going to say, this is the perfect transition to this topic. Why isn't this in development at, I don't know, Warner Brothers or MGM or somewhere?
Yeah.
It's like, where's the script doctor on this one right now?
100%. You could write this in a screenplay and sell it to Disney tomorrow. Like, it's one of those kind of movies.
Get Gavin O'Connor involved. We'll have another miracle on our hands.
Exactly. It is another miracle on ice. It's just a different type of miracle this time.
Yeah.
And it was so poetic. And as a hockey fan, just the beauty of that poetry. And of course, as a Michigan fan, that makes me all the more biased.
It's even close to home for you.
Exactly.
It is your home, not home team, but your team.
My favorite team to watch. Yeah, at least at the college level.
Yeah.
And it was so thrilling. Like, it's one of those things where, as a sports fan, as a fan of that team, you win in overtime. It's this incredible, gripping game. That alone will get you excited. Right. But then you see who scores it, and it's just nothing but tears. Like, everyone that is a part of the Michigan fandom who is watching this game, we are all simultaneously sobbing because of the poetry.
How many tears did you shed specifically?
Oh, I got emotional for sure.
I mean, you already wear your heart on your sleeve so heavily. It's like, I can't imagine what this did to you.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I was very much moved by it. And you see him celebrating his teammates, of course. You know, in that moment, you're going to be excited anyway. It's an overtime winner. It's thrilling, but there was a heightened level of it because they know who scored it and they knew what that meant in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And not even just him coming back. It was also his first ever college goal. Like, everything about it was the scripts of the movies. It really was. It truly is. I mean, sometimes we watch these movies and it feels so unattainable that it's like, these things never happen in real life. Well, they do.
This is why I think, and we're going to talk about this. This is why I think that maybe the quote unquote inspirational aspects of sports movies is kind of a dying criticism that just needs to go away. There perhaps, to your point with this story here, there might be some truth to some of that.
And that's the thing,
from an emotional standpoint.
100%. Like, as I laid out that story and you transition that, or you think about it in screenplay terms, and it's like, oh, of course, like this, it almost sounds a derivative.
Yeah.
But there is something about the human element at play and the inspirational element, as you're talking about there, that is so deeply moving still. And it was great to see. To see it in real time, it was just phenomenal.
I think if you weren't going to become a dad soon, you'd probably take some time to just write a draft screenplay and send it in to see who picks it up.
Well, I will have some time.
You will. That's true. Maybe. That's true. Yeah.
And I guess on that note, this might be my last show for a while. I don't know.
Yeah.
Baby Andrew is getting closer and closer to being here. I am actually recording in his room. I can't really take the camera. I'd love to show everybody, but to my left is his entire setup with his crib and his dresser and all of the Star Wars decor, baby Yoda and baby Star Wars decor to my left. It's pretty incredible.
You're already trying to train him right when it comes to artistic content.
Exactly.
By age 2, he's going to say his favorite movie is How to Train Your Dragon.
Yeah, exactly.
And then
I hope
Guillermo
so.
del Toro's Pinocchio.
Exactly. One could hope. I'm definitely going to try to lead him down the right path here. So.
You are such a good dad.
I'm trying. I'm definitely trying. At any rate, I thought that was a really fun and great and inspiring story to lead us into our top 5 sports movies. That's how we're going to start off the show here. As I mentioned, we did do this once on episode 8. Brennan was not a part of the show at that time.
Right.
As we get into this, and I'm curious, Brendan, because some of these movies, many of them we might talk about here, we've talked about in some capacity or another over the last 10 years, but
yeah.
Did you have any criteria that you kind of implemented here? For this
I will
exercise?
say, I know we're calling this top 5 sports movies. This might not be a 100% true list for me, mostly because we have talked a lot about these movies over the years. Now, some of the films I'm going to talk about, I feel like I just need to. So maybe there will be some repetition there going to films that we have kind of exhausted in past conversations and past episodes. But I did also want to try and at least throw a few in there that might be a little bit outside the box. Maybe even one or two that I might even try and get your thoughts on in the moment and ask, do you even consider this a sports movie? And we might get a little loose with the term, and that's also part of my criteria. Sometimes a good sports movie is not really about the sport. Sometimes the sport can also be a bit secondary to support some type of other emotional or comedic narrative through line. And I'm looking at sort of all of that compounding, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it might not be the truest of lists, but I did want to throw some variety in there while also throwing attention to the films that kind of need to be talked about within the realm of sports movies.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And if I know you well, there's one movie in particular, given that criteria, that I think you're going to talk about.
Well, I have it at number 5, so maybe we'll just see if you can guess what it is right away when we get to that point.
To that point, though, there are 2 movies on my list that fall under that same umbrella, though, that, where I think the sport is somewhat secondary, or at least it's underneath and it's supporting the character and emotion that is on the surface. There's also one on my list that will echo episode 8, that original list. It's just one of those movies I cannot leave off a list like this.
Yeah, and I think I know one that might be.
And then there's a few others that were not on that original list that I've perhaps caught up with over the last 10 years, or maybe that have even come out since we did that original list. So I tried to cover the gamut in a similar fashion there. So ultimately, this list is different. It will be different from episode 8, but it carries my sensibilities. It's a quintessential JD list, I think. So,
all right, well, that's good to hear.
But to your point, also, I will say this: it is not what I would say is a true list, because I was trying to channel all of these various things. It's certainly not a true list, but given what we're trying to do, it's quintessential in that regard. So.
And I am also trying to cover the sports gamut a little bit too. So I didn't want to have like 5 baseball movies or 5 boxing movies or 5 basketball themed movies. I wanted there to be a little bit of an athletic variety, if that makes sense too.
I have 5 different sports.
You have 5 different. Okay, I don't quite have 5 different, but it's pretty close. They're pretty close to all being different.
I will say 2 of them are pretty adjacent to each other, but ultimately 5 different sports.
I wonder if we'll have any crossover. I think there's at least one. The film I have as my number 1, which we'll get to as this conversation unfolds for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if that's also on your list. I'll just say that.
All right. I'm very excited. Let's dive into it. Brendan, what do you have at your number 5?
Well, what do you think is my number 5?
Everybody wants some.
That's it. It's everybody wants. Which, we obviously do think a lot alike. And I might get a lot of pushback from a lot of people listening who might think this is not a sports movie. You can't talk about this one. I'm curious, JD, do you think this one should qualify?
Well, it is a really interesting question. I do think it qualifies because there are sports movies, quote unquote sports movies out there, where the sport is very much secondary. There's one on my list I can think of where this is very much the case, where the sport in the movie I'm going to bring up, you don't really see it played all that much.
Yeah.
It's just kind of there lingering in the background. It's more driving character and motive more than it is action. So in that sense, if the sport is there and it's a big reason as to why these characters come together and it's what's driving camaraderie, such as what I assume you're about to get into, you can't take the sport away from that. You take baseball out of that movie. I think it's baseball that they're.
It is baseball, yeah. 1980s baseball in Texas, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you take that away, and these characters don't come. Like, there's no reason for them to come together. So
yeah,
and like the camaraderie is driven by that locker room environment. So
it is.
I think you make a great case for it.
And that's exactly what I was going to talk about here. And not just the fact that we look at other sports movies where the sport is secondary. Does it become contradictory to say that a movie like Everybody Wants Some then should not qualify? It's like when we see contradictory calls made by referees during a sports game. And does that mean the next call that they make must be in line with everything else, especially if it's a playoff match or something? There's a lot of, like, we saw that with the latest Super Bowl and that last holding call that was called. There was a lot of debate about that very thing. So if you use that analogy here, should Everybody Want Some then be qualified as a sports movie or not? And I think it still should, because of what you're saying. It's not just the camaraderie, but I think the overall idea of athleticism is kind of what this movie's about in some ways. It's about like the cocky attitude, the exterior, the arrogance that comes with early athleticism. Athletes in college, just starting college, that's really the camaraderie that brings them all together. So if you take that away, it literally is a movie about nothing then. So while the movie isn't about baseball, it's about the mentality of what it means to be a great athlete at a young and arrogant age. And that's where I think the movie is really great. I mean, certainly the whole male camaraderie element and the fact that it has this like cultural thing going on between jocks and artsy people and punks and all these people in college that are kind of trying to find themselves. They belong in different cliques. It sort of deconstructs the whole clique mentality to be a bit accepting of what your background and overall passions are. But the sports aspect and the way that these characters behave with one another, almost like a fraternity like environment, it is because of the sport. And the sport there is the reason for that, which is why I feel like I needed to talk about it here. Just also considering the fact it's one of my favorite movies in this sort of echelon of Linklater meandering buddy movies. So I wanted to find a reason to talk about it, but I do think it certainly qualifies more than it doesn't.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if that's a movie that came out 30 years ago that would be a massive cult hit. It certainly feels that way to me.
Yeah.
But coming out in the modern age where there's hundreds of movies that come out each year, it's easy for films like this to get lost. But I do think it's one of those Linklater classic meandering movies. I really like it. I think the camaraderie at the center of it, as you're talking about, is really great. And it's well made. The acting is phenomenal. The camaraderie within the performances, they give credence to all of that. So, yeah, I very much agree with you. That's a movie that I really, really enjoy quite a bit as well. For my number 5, I'm going to the world of F1 racing.
Okay.
There's a couple of great options here. I don't know if it's going to be the one that you anticipate that I'm going to say. I'm actually going with Asif Kapadia's documentary Senna from 2010.
I was thinking it was going to be one of two. It was going to be either Senna or Rush.
Yes.
Yeah. If I were a betting man, I would have bet Rush. So this is, I guess,
it would have been a good bet.
Yeah.
And I went back and forth between the two. But as I noted earlier, some of these movies we've talked about quite a bit. I will say, though, I was still this close to picking Rush because it is incredible and a little bit ironic because we did this list originally the same year Rush came out, but before that hit theaters later in the fall. So there would have been a little bit of poeticism, I guess, to bring it back to this topic. But, I have talked about Rush quite a bit over these last 10 years. I haven't really talked about Senna all that much. I maybe have mentioned it on one other top 3 or top 5 list that we've done. I'm not sure. But this is an incredible and gripping documentary. In fact, it feels more like a thriller than a documentary.
It's always interesting when
parts.
a sports documentary almost becomes a real narrative movie, at least just given the narrative choices it makes, the aesthetics, and the fact that it has such propulsion to it.
Yeah. The filmmaking by Capadia is really wonderful. There, it lacks the conventional interviews, which is great, but it's also how he overlays audio from the dialogue that we do hear with historical footage, which, by the way, I don't know how he got all of this footage that spans years of Senna's life. Like it's incredible. It's like he had a camera and just followed Senna around, knowing what was going to happen in the future. Like he was a time traveler.
That's insane. It really is.
It's really incredible. I'm not sure how he did it, how he was able to put it all together, but it makes for an exhilarating and intimate and ultimately heartbreaking look at Senna's life and career. It's very thorough. You really get not just the racing side of Senna, what made him such a brilliant racer, but you get the human component, the human condition, what's driving out, pun intended, many of his actions that he ultimately takes, and innovation in the sport, safety, his eagerness for safety, and of course the tragic irony that another racer dies the day before he does. And we get to experience with him what would have felt like for him to see and witness that up close. And then the next day, it happens all over again. And unfortunately it was him. And it's just, it's definitely a poignant documentary, but there's so much to it in terms of its emotions and what makes the sport so great and so appealing to a lot of people. So really phenomenal documentary.
And I think that's why in the specific category of this sport and the movies that are about this sport, Senna might be the best because it is detailed from one specific perspective, and that is Senna himself. I mean, as much as I enjoy Rush, and I think that's a more rewatchable movie, there is more to say about the competitive nature between those two people. Whereas Senna is really more about one man's relationship with the sport itself. So it becomes more about the sport then. And I think that makes it even more of an important representation of it. And you're right. It's heartbreaking. I'm glad you talk about a documentary there because I'm transitioning to another documentary for my number 4. And this is where I guess I'm getting a little bit, I want to say loose with my top 5, but this is where it might be a little bit more maybe disingenuous because I'm not sure if this movie would actually be in my top 5 favorite sports movies if I were to do like a subjective list. But it is a movie I watched for the first time pretty recently. It's one that my fiance Maris absolutely loves. And I'm not sure if you've even seen it, JD, but it's a movie called The Endless Summer. It came out in 1965. It's a surfing movie. And it is, it is directed by Bruce Brown, his name is. It details the journey of 2 California surfers named Robert August and Michael Hansen, I believe his name is. They go on this journey to live what they call an endless summer. They go to Africa, they go to Ghana, and just ride the waves there, trying to experience what is literally an endless summer because of the way that the seasons don't change there. It's warm all year round, and they want to experience what the surfing culture could be like. And in many cases, like when they go to Africa, the culture does not exist. This is 1965. So they're bringing a new culture to these natives who have not only ever really seen a surfboard before, but maybe even a white man before. So it's really interesting in that regard. But what I love about the film and what I was really taken by, really 2 things. It's really, well, first off, it's really about a cultural adventure, not just bringing one culture of California to different lands, but the way different demographics and natives relate to one another and how that language barrier is really challenged. But it also invites us into this sporting culture of surfing in a very interesting way, because it really does a good job detailing the mentality and the vibe of how people behave and talk to each other. The movie is absolutely hilarious. I mean, Bruce Brown, who directed and wrote this, he narrates it as well. And some of the stuff he says and narrates is some of the funniest stuff I've ever seen in any sports movie, documentary or not. Like it shows this one moment where these two surfers that he's following, Robert and Mike, when they're packing for their trip, he says something over the narration that, and they pack, and here's what they pack for their own first aid: a single Band-Aid. and then shows them put a single Band-Aid in there, just detailing how devilish that they sometimes are, how daring that they are, almost Evil Knievel like. And I love that it gets into this whole mentality. So as a cultural sports film, I think it's a really interesting one. It might not be one of my favorites in the grand scheme of things, but I think it's one worth talking about because of what it details.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have not seen that film. I do remember you mentioning it to me offline here. It's a blind spot for me, and not one that we've ever talked about here on the show.
I think it's a first. That's another reason why I wanted to talk about it. It is on Amazon Prime. If you're ever thinking about watching it. It's only about 95 minutes, I think. So it's a pretty breezy watch, for lack of a better term. But it's an interesting one.
Okay. Well, that is fascinating. Certainly one to add to the list. My number 4 is a movie that everyone has seen, or at the very least is familiar with. If you build it, he will come. Field of Dreams. My number 4. This was not on my list originally when we did this on episode 8. And I've always liked this movie, but it wasn't until I became a father where it went to a different stratosphere.
Isn't that the argument for this movie every single time? It's when you become a dad, this becomes the greatest movie ever made.
It certainly, I don't know. There's something about becoming a father, at least for me, that is just profound. It changes your worldview. And when it comes to movies, it does offer up a different perspective. Like you're able to look at it in a new way. And watching this post being a father, I did have that transcendent experience. And it was funny, Brendan, because I knew that I was going to bring this up. I actually went and watched that last sequence, the last 15 minutes of this. I had to watch it and get my emotions out earlier, because it's one thing to become emotional when you're doing an audio only podcast, but now that there's a visual nature to this, I didn't want to necessarily succumb to it yet. It will happen eventually. I will cry on camera at some point, but not yet. At least we'll see how this conversation
and we know
goes,
you won't be ashamed of that. You've cried on the podcast many times, and you've been proud of that.
Yeah, I just haven't done it on camera.
Yeah,
but
we'll get there.
Who knows? Maybe that won't change anything.
We'll do a commentary on Field of Dreams one day, and then that'll be the one that breaks the back.
Could be. It could be. But you know what is so fascinating about this film, and we can get to the emotion of it. But circling back to what we were talking about earlier, what's fascinating about this film is that while there is some baseball on screen, this isn't really a baseball movie in many respects. This is more so reconciling with the past. And you get two different elements of that I find fascinating. One, there's the historical angle of baseball. It's really compelling how they use the Black Sox scandal as a way to, I guess, drive a lot of the drama here and a lot of the fantasy of this film, and how they bring back characters that are inspired by real life players, revolving around all of that. It's interesting to see this film as a fan of the sport reconcile with one of its worst, moments in history. So it is fascinating from that angle. And then there's, of course, the Costner character of Ray, where he is having to reconcile with his own regret as it relates to his father, and not being able to come to peace with him before he passed away. That idea on its own is what offers incredible poignancy to If You Build It, He Will Come. And as this exercise in fantasy, this exercise in wanting to like a man wanting to bring peace to that relationship, and this is his way of doing it.
Yeah.
Whether it's real or not is beside the point. It certainly offers up some great drama at times in this film, for sure.
Yeah.
But that internalized coping process, I just find incredibly fascinating. There's wonderful complexities at play here. And then it leads to that great moment at the end where,
Are you going to
do you
cry
wanna
on
have a
camera?
catch?
Are you going to cry on camera?
No, not yet. But that line is one of the best lines of dialogue in any sports movie ever written.
Sure.
It's so good. And Costner offers great credence to it. It's wonderful. Yeah, Field of Dreams. I love it. My number 4 here.
Yeah, it's a great honorable mention for me. It's probably one that'll escalate higher as I eventually and hopefully become a dad myself. And what I love about it even now is, despite the fantastical element, it still does have a love for the sport and a respect for the sport, which is sometimes something that gets a little bit lost in many sports movies that have some other component to it, some other genre component to it. In this case, something very fantastical, but it still has a respect for the love of the sport as well as the history of the sport. In many ways, it could potentially be a pretty interesting companion piece to the film 8 Men Out from 1988, which is very directly about the Black Sox scandal of 1919. And I've heard people talk about that. This certainly seems to deal with it in a very different way, but it is it's a very rewatchable and tender and sweet film. And there's nothing wrong with that, because many sports movies are inherently that, and I love that about it. So yeah, great honorable mention for me. I'm going to transition to something much dire, much more dire, at least, for my number 3. In fact, my number 3 and number 2 kind of work hand in hand. They're both very, for lack of a better term, depressing movies, but they also kind of use the sport as yet another secondary thing. But for my number 3, I'm going to the year 2008. Darren Aronofsky's The Wrestler for my number 3. And it's interesting. I'm not even really a big fan of this type of wrestling as a sport, to be perfectly honest.
Sure.
But it kind of goes hand in hand with what we talked about some weeks ago when we reviewed the movie Close, and how we talked about hockey in that film being more of a therapeutic and emotional punching bag of sorts. And in many ways, that's what the sport of wrestling has now become for Randy the Ram Robinson, and a representation of what he can't lose, what he still only knows, and how that has left such a disconnect with what he still wants out of life. And I this is one of those times where I feel like Darren Aronofsky actually does play with subtlety very well. He's a very belligerent filmmaker, but this is one where I think there is a surprising tender and ambiguous quality to the way that he actually handles theme and emotion. It has a much visceral, or more visceral quality to it that almost feels like a documentary at times. And Mickey Rourke, I think, probably should have won the Oscar that year. I know Sean Penn, gave a great performance in Milk that same year. I think that's what it was. But I do think Mickey Rourke really should have at least had more consideration for that. I think he really is quite great. So it's a film that really isn't about wrestling. It does use it as a representation of pain and suffering, and we certainly see that on screen, but I think it handles it really well. I think it's a very emotional film. It's certainly my favorite Darren Aronofsky film. I think it's really quite great.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, when we did that retrospective, this was your number 1?
Yeah, I think in hindsight, it would probably be my number 2 now, because I've grown to love Wall-E a lot more. So I think now Wall-E would take the top spot, but it has, if I remember correctly, it has always been between those two films as my 2 favorites of 2008.
Yeah, Wall-E was my number 2 when we did that retrospective.
Okay.
I regrettably had this at number 13, which
you did.
Is still good. It's in a good spot.
It was a pretty good year.
It was a great year. I mean, I'm looking at my top 10 there, and I don't know which one I'd have to remove in order to give The Wrestler a spot, but also we're nitpicking there because I wholeheartedly agree with everything you're saying. It's a great movie.
Yeah.
I do love it a lot as well. And I'm sure we talked about it quite a bit on the retrospective.
We did.
If people want to go and check that out. For my number 3, Brendan, I think, the more I think about this, I think Creed is the best of the Rocky Creed franchise.
No, I'm already there.
You're already there? Okay.
At the very least, it is my favorite. I mean,
Yeah.
it's still. I mean, Creed is only 8 years old at this point. It certainly doesn't have the life that Rocky has had yet, with that coming out in 1976. So,
Mhm.
but at the same time, in those 8 years, the cultural impact has been quite big. So to think in maybe 20 years or so, I think we'll still be talking about Creed.
I think so as well. I do think its legacy, its reputation in another 50 years, I think it'll be as prominent as Rocky.
I
or
think the
as,
thing,
as
yeah,
solid.
I think the thing that's going to help it out is the fact that it came out at this time when legacy sequels are such a thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do think that those types of films, those types of sequels, if you want to call it that, they'll have some legs for a while. We're still going to see a lot of them for quite some years, I think. And the fact that Creed does it so well, in fact, the argument I think could be made that it might be the best legacy sequel ever made.
Seriously, yeah.
I think that's another reason why it's going to have some staying power outside of just, the cultural aspect of it. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I was just on another show talking about the Best Picture nominees of 1976.
Yeah.
And at the end of that episode, we collectively as a panel decided that we didn't have to redo the Oscars. And I, as much as I love the other 4 nominations that came along with Rocky and Rocky winning Best Picture, like, honestly, I think Rocky is one of the best sports movies ever made. I don't have any issue with its win there. It wouldn't have been my personal choice, but I have no issue with it being a Best Picture winner. I think it's, in many respects, just as deserving. It is a really, really great sports movie and a phenomenal honorable mention here on my list. But there's something about how Creed, the film Creed, channels the legacy of Rocky and how it incorporates it into this new and invigorating story here with Adonis that I think is great. Like that Adonis Rocky relationship here, thematically at the core of the film, it's about how family isn't defined by DNA. Apollo was family to Rocky. In fact, throughout a lot of that film, Adonis calls Rocky uncle. So the closeness of their relationship is very much embodied on screen. And then you couple that with Coogler's filmmaking and the direction of the film and just how sharp the writing is here. Like, everything about this movie, it is the quintessential sports movie, the quintessential legacy sequel. The performances here are incredible. Michael B. Jordan, obviously very good. Sylvester Stallone was my pick for Best Supporting Actor that year. Nothing against Mark Rylance. He's
still great in that movie. Yeah.
I completely agree, but my vote would have went to Sylvester Stallone. I mean, how he channels, Rocky's history to evoke a new fight that Rocky's having to battle in that film while being that mentor to Adonis is just incredible. It's so good and so moving, and it's been circulating on social media the last few weeks. But that last fight that you see at the end of that film is truly one of the best sports sequences ever put to film. It is so good. And the musicality of it is incredible, right?
Waiting for the right moment to bring that score back.
It teases, right? It teases throughout the film, and in that scene, in that sequence, it teases it. And then you get that line from Rocky about being a Creed and I love you. And then that's when, oh my God, it is so good.
That moment when Adonis, when he finally reveals what he's fighting for, or at least trying to fight against, I guess, what his real enemy is. It really is beautiful.
So love it.
It's interesting, when I was putting together this list and I was trying to battle myself, I guess. I kept putting on films like The Endless Summer, like I talked about later. I'm not sure if that I'm not sure if that would actually be in my top 5, but I wanted to talk about it because it's a different film.
Mhm.
But I did keep going back to Creed, knowing that in actuality, it's probably one of my 5 favorite sports movies. It is my favorite of the Rocky universe, the Rockyverse or Creedverse, whatever you want to call it as now. And I really love the fact that Ryan Coogler got it made in the way that he always wanted and envisioned it. It's
Mhm.
very rare that a movie like this, that is this Lego sequel to such a popular franchise that only got aesthetically bigger as each one came out,
Mhm.
was still this deeply rooted in indie film sensibilities.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it in many ways it's a blockbuster, but it's also not. And it straddles that line so well. It has this urban grime to it that most blockbusters don't. It doesn't have this polish. It doesn't have this sheen, despite this rewatchability. It's something you don't often see just in modern movies in general, and I really respect that.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it just has everything you'd want in a movie like this in terms of the action and Coogler's filmmaking. It really is engrossing to watch, cinematically speaking, but then you start to think about what it's doing in terms of character and theme and the complexities at play there, like these individuals coming together at this time, how that makes sense for them given their past and how it's sort of pseudo crossed before, but not directly until the events of this film, and how ultimately they need each other to make it to the end. Like Rocky doesn't make it to the end of this movie without Adonis and vice versa.
Right.
And to see them become that support system, that's like that level of nuance and characterization and emotion is what gives credence.
It gives credence.
Exactly. I totally did that on purpose.
Oh, sure you did. Sure.
To that moment we mentioned earlier, as Creed prepares for the 12th round of that final bout, and that line there from Rocky, that doesn't carry as much weight without, the level of characterization and theme that we get here.
And the film doesn't need to explain that. There's natural dialogue. It's a great screenplay that's able to cue us in on that, and it does it in a way that makes you think about it further, rather than just blueprinting the whole thematic idea for you, which some other movies in these categories might do, but this one does it very smartly. And it's a beautiful film. It really is.
Yeah.
And it's great that you talk about a boxing movie at your number 3 there, because for my number 2, I'm going to another boxing movie. And this is one we did talk about a lot during our 2004 retrospective.
Okay.
That is Million Dollar Baby, Clint Eastwood's Million Dollar Baby. Yeah. Perhaps one of the most devastating sports movies that I can think of, at least in this specific sports category. But again, much like with The Wrestler that I just talked about with my number 3, the sport is kind of secondary. It's really there as an emotional, and in this case, literal punching bag for the Hilary Swank character of Maggie Fitzgerald, and what she's trying to fight for as well as fight against, and how that then relates to Clint Eastwood as this literal broken father figure of Frankie Dunn. But what I do think is interesting is that Clint Eastwood is doing some pretty interesting things socially and politically, even if he's not very direct with it. I mean, the fact that it does get into, feminine representation in a sport like this that is driven by violence and, dare I say, machismo at times. I feel like that's sort of Frankie Dunn's perspective on it. The way that then relates to Maggie's own family, the way that I mean, the movie's almost 20 years old at this point. I'll just say it. The way that this movie then kind of deals with euthanasia by the end and gets kind of into the the medical ramifications of a sport like this. So the sport is still kind of key to the plot, even if it's not what drives the plot. It kind of uses the sport to get into different aspects of the sports world that we don't often talk about. Even if I overlook that, when you just look at the character representation here and just the relationships here, it's a very tender and loving movie and very old fashioned. It almost feels like an old black and white film from the 1950s or 60s,
Sure.
which
Yeah.
is perhaps my favorite thing about it. It is one of those movies I would have loved to see get the grayscale treatment, but it almost already is that, given its use of shadow. It almost looks like a gray movie, and I love the way that Eastwood is pulling those old-fashioned influences for something that still has a modern sense of place and a modern topicality to it. And I think he does so really interestingly. So yeah, $1 Million Baby, I think, is a great movie. It's not one I often rewatch for obvious reasons, but I do think it's great.
No, it is very good. Certainly one of Eastwood's best directorial efforts. I miss that Clint Eastwood. I don't know what he's become these days, but
there was a point in Clint Eastwood's directorial career where we got spoiled by him. Like, remember how we always talk
We
about
did.
being spoiled by Pixar when Pixar was doing The Incredibles and then Ratatouille? Like, it was a 5-star run every time. Clint Eastwood was almost doing the same thing. Like, once Mystic River was almost like a new debut for him. Like, once Mystic River came out, it was that $1 Million Baby, Letters from Iwo Jima. I actually really like Changeling. I know a lot of people don't, but then a lot of people also like Gran Torino. So there were a lot of hits there that I think spoiled us once we got to movies like Hereafter and whatever he was doing in the 2010s with the 1517 to Paris and things like that's a fascinatingly bad movie though. But it's like, but I love the idea and the experiment of it. He's never afraid to experiment. I have to give him some credit there.
I know, and it's also interesting in hindsight, or at least knowing how he films, where they do one take and that's it.
Yeah,
that he was still able to make these incredibly great films one after another, doing it that way. Like, it's kind of a miracle.
I would love to be a fly on the wall when making movies like $1 Million Baby, for instance, because if he is still maintaining that whole one take and we're done mentality, what is he doing to get these actors in the right headspace to just carry the conversation as naturally as it needs to? That
it's
is
incredible.
So interesting.
It truly is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And $1 Million Baby is a wonderful movie. It's a great honorable mention for me.
Okay.
And honestly, I don't really have too much to add on to what you're saying. I think it's a lot of what we just talked about with Rocky in terms of the action and the sport. Simply, it's there as a crux, as a support vehicle for
the whole underdog aspect of it is certainly there too. Yeah,
absolutely. Good stuff there for my number 2. This is where we transition, or we start to blur the lines between episode 8 and this episode, because there is going to be crossover here. This was on my previous list.
Okay.
And I cannot leave it off. I cannot leave this film off.
Oh, you are such a warrior, JD.
No, I'm not getting there yet.
Oh my gosh, not yet. Oh, I was
okay.
Okay. Am I spoiling things by accident?
You're spoiling things. In the old structure, I would edit that out, but I'm not going to do that.
Oh my gosh. I thought I was on a roll here. I thought I was guessing
jump the
correctly.
gun here.
Okay, my bad.
No, all good. I'm going to my favorite hockey movie. The best hockey movie ever made is Jay Roach's Mystery Alaska from 1998. I really like this movie, and I do think it's more objectively flawed than something like Miracle, for example. Miracle is a well-made, more seamless experience, but I don't think it's also a little bit more tepid. Mystery Alaska is a little bit more bold. It has more, I think, biting characters, like more rough around the edges characters that make it a little bit more intriguing and fascinating to me.
It's a better movie. As a movie, I think it's a better experience in that regard.
Yeah. I at least think it has more prickly nuances than something like Miracle. Miracle plays out within that Disney formula. Now, it does that well, don't get me wrong, but that does make it a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more fluid, a little bit more lukewarm for me. Good, but kind of mundane in a way. Mystery Alaska, the highs and lows are different. Like, they're more extreme, but I think that prickliness adds flavor to the film that I really like. And I think it's more bold in the sense that, like, you look at what that film is trying to do, and on one level, it's this interesting look at the game from a pure hockey perspective. And this is where what I love about it, and this is where I'm getting emotional. Like this is a movie that loves the game of hockey, loves it. And there's this interesting dichotomy regarding purity, like that pure raw love for the sport, versus the organized corporate side of it, which is much more banal and much more tepid, right? And you get that more brazenly with, I forget the character's name, but the one that, works for the NHL or works for the New York Rangers, and he's trying to set up this whole thing like as a publicity stunt.
Yeah.
But you can also look at it more broadly just in terms of the game itself. You have the New York Rangers of the NHL. So you have the corporate organized team that comes from, albeit the highest level that you'll get within the sport.
Yeah.
But it's representative symbolically of that corporate thing. And what they're playing is anything but that. It is guys that don't get paid to do this.
Mm-hmm.
They play and are selected and chosen because of their skill set and their raw talent and their love of the game. That's the only way you make it onto that pond in Mystery Alaska.
Right.
So you have to have a deep bond, a deep relationship with that sport. And how does that come through? That dichotomy, how does that crystallize when they are fighting for this game in a courtroom scene where they send their lawyer, the Bailey character, and he starts talking about why these guys play the game.
Yeah.
They skate to skate. They play to play. They don't make $1 million a year. They do it for the love of the game.
Did it finally happen? Is it happening?
I love it. That is aside from the movie that I'll get to with my number one, it is my favorite moment in any sports film ever. And it speaks to the core of who I am, like as a sports fan and as a person who indulges, like actually plays the game of hockey. It gets to the nucleus of who I am in that regard.
Yeah.
And I love it. I absolutely love it. And of course, it also speaks fundamentally to that dichotomy. So there's thematic credence to it as well, not just emotional. And it's great. I absolutely love it. And the hockey itself is the most, again, it's a heightened version because it's a movie, but it's the most realistic hockey I've ever seen in a movie.
Yeah.
And that includes Miracle. So, that also adds a level of something to this movie that I love and appreciate. Again, it adds to the idea that this film loves the game of hockey. It has to manufacture it because it is a movie, but it does it with the most authenticity. Like it wants to channel that as much as it possibly can while still being dramatic and emotional. And then, of course, it also does the Rocky thing.
Yeah.
Which I do appreciate, especially in 1998 where we had moved away from that. You get that more in the 70s. The 80s and 90s kind of veered more toward the other end of that spectrum where the good guys win and it's the Mighty Ducks. We have to win everything. Yep. And Mr. Alaska says, no thanks. We're not interested in that.
All right, so I'm going to keep this brief and simply say it's very fresh that a sports movie like this comes around where the sport is actually the main character. I feel like in many ways hockey is the star. I mean, there are characters, human characters here, but it's not that often you see the sport be the star. And I feel like that's the case here. And I want to leave it at that because, well, for two reasons. One, I know I already basically spoiled your number one, so I feel like you might as well just go ahead and keep going. And secondly, I want you to keep going because the tears are kind of fresh. Will we actually see you cry on camera now that the tears are kind of fresh? So, you know what? I'm playing an audible here. Just keep going. What's your number one?
Well, I mean, obviously my number one is Warrior.
Yeah.
And, I guess I can tell the story again. It's been a while. We reviewed this on the show, but it was, what was it, 2015 maybe? That we did this?
Yeah. Was I on that one? I think I was on that
so.
one.
Yeah, I believe you were there.
It was like a revisited
I can't recall
review.
Who the guest was, but
yeah.
But yeah, we did talk about this quite a bit in 2015. I'm not sure what the episode number is. I might have to put it in the show notes, but
Try and look that up.
I will retell this in case we have any new listeners or viewers here on YouTube that haven't heard this story. But it's one of my favorite film experiences ever because the film comes out in 2011.
Yeah,
and I did not watch it when it first came out because you see the trailer and you're like, that looks incredibly tropey. No, thank you. The marketing for that film was atrocious. However, some months later at one of the dollar theaters locally where I was at the time, because they always get the movies way later than everybody else.
Yeah.
So a group of friends, I did not decide this, but my group of friends, there was probably about a dozen of us, decide, let's go watch Warrior at the dollar theater. And I was like, okay, fine, whatever. And so I walk in with zero expectations. If anything, I had negative expectations because the marketing was bad. And
yeah, that's not false.
Halfway through this film, I looked down the row of myself and all of my friends, and we are all collectively, simultaneously sobbing. Like every single one of us. This film is quintessential best surprise movie. It is why we love doing that every single year at the InSession Film Awards, because there are those movies that come along that you don't really think much of, and then it knocks you out. Maybe pun intended again.
Yeah.
And
nice
this
work.
was certainly
You're full of dad jokes right now, man.
and because like we've been talking about with $1 Million Baby or Creed, this is one of those movies, and this is certainly adjacent to boxing, which is probably why boxing movies, now MMA movies, are such a great vehicle for human stories because of the metaphor at play. And, because this is a movie about fighting for your family. That's really what it is.
Yeah.
And that might sound trite, it might sound derivative, but in execution in this film, in Warrior, it is exhilarating. It is breathtaking in every single way. That idea of recovery and forgiveness and how that comes through here in this father-son relationship. Like, and this is where it's going to come because I can't talk about it without talking about the performances at the center of this film that are so incredible. Because I think of a couple of scenes here, right? There's the scene where Patty, is that the character's name? I'm trying to recall here off the cuff here.
I think so.
Yeah, I might have to look it up here real fast. Patty Conlon. Okay,
that's
so it's seared into my brain. I had to look for it a little bit, but it was there. I shouldn't have questioned myself. I should have just went straight with it. Nick Nolte, that scene where he goes to Brendan, the Joel Edgerton character's house, and he's just begging to come inside. And he's like, no, I don't want anything to do with you. Like, that scene is seared into the DNA of my cinephiledom. Like, I think about it a lot. And then you juxtapose that with the scene at the end of the film with Tommy in the hotel room. Oh my God. Just it's like those two scenes and what they mean for this film as a father just trying to reach his sons however he can. And in that particular dichotomy, he's sober, and in the other sense, he's not. And yet, by the end of the film, in a very indirect way, he is able to reconnect with them, even if it's indirectly. And how that comes through in the filmmaking, in the music that we hear there at the end. It is. And Nick Nolte, he would have won the Oscar for me, or if we did the InSession Film Awards for that year, he would have
for sure,
won Best Supporting Actor. I also think that since we've been doing this, and this is slightly previous or slightly earlier to us starting InSession Film, but I'm going to include it anyway. But since doing InSession Film, top 5 favorite performance, and just in terms of favorite, Nick Nolte's performance in that film, I think, is legendary. I think it is incredible.
Yep.
And arguably the best performance in a sports movie. Like
I think it should be. I think it should be
sports
in the
movies.
conversation for sure. I think most people forget that he was nominated for an Oscar for it,
Yeah.
which means the movie wasn't ignored when it came to award season, which is interesting because I know a lot of people hold the film in general in such high regard.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. Like, I'm curious what its box office was. I don't think it made a ton of movie. Like, according to this, it made 23 million. I don't know how accurate that is.
Yeah,
On a $25 million budget, which not good. So like it's one of those weird things where it came and went. No one really went to see it. I'm not sure what its critical reviews were when it first released.
They're pretty good. I think like as far as Metacritic is concerned, I think it held like a 71 or something.
Okay, that's not
like
bad.
That. Yeah.
84% Rotten Tomatoes. So not too bad critically speaking, but for a film,
but
to just
not loud enough to really scream, you have to see this movie.
Yeah. And in 2011, obviously this was also before the streaming wars began.
Yeah.
I like if this came out now, I don't know if Nolte gets nominated. Like, who knows? But this would also probably go straight to Netflix, and
this would go straight to something. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so I don't know. It's one of those performances that it's kind of insane that he did get nominated, given the all the context surrounding the film. But it is so deserving. But that is the power of it, right? It is so undeniable that even in a middling movie that nobody went to see in 2011, that you have to nominate it. But for me, this is my favorite sports movie. I would still argue, even on an objective scale, that it is one of the best sports movies ever made.
Yeah, and I do think maybe some of that box office numbers, I think that might also be a reflection on the sport itself, which is perhaps one that a lot of people just don't really know enough about, especially at the time in 2011. So maybe there was a lot of ignorance at play there, unfortunately. I mean, it's a sport I don't really know a lot about. I don't really follow MMA. But what I do,
the only thing I know is Jake Gyllenhaal is just there filming stuff all the time.
Oh yeah, for the next Roadhouse movie or something like that.
We're gonna see the entire movie on people's iPhones before that movie is.
We really are. It's going viral right now, man. The guy looks ripped. But anyway, but with regard to Warrior, I think maybe the sport itself had something to do with those box office numbers. I don't really know. I'm just speculating at this point, but it is certainly one of those films that it's the kind of movie that people find. Like we always have those movies out there that are discovered back in the DVD age or the Blu-ray age, the video rental age. I mean, that's why a movie like The Shawshank Redemption became so big, was because people found it way after it was actually ever playing in theaters. And I feel like Warrior is kind of in that same camp, just in its own, digital echelon, if that makes sense. Because I know a lot of people that love this movie outside of our critic circle. I mean, my parents love this movie. So it has caught on, and I'm glad that it has, even if it wasn't at the time in 2011. So I do think it'll have some legs in the world of sports movies. It didn't quite make my top 5, but it would be in my top 10. I do think it is a great movie.
Before we move on, though,
yeah,
one final note on Warrior.
Yeah,
because we talked a lot about Patty, but we didn't talk as much, and obviously we're not here to review the movie, but I did want to briefly mention the dynamic between Brendan and Tommy, which I think is equally great, but especially in that final fight that they have at the end of the film, and how Brendan is trying to reach to Tommy in a very physical sense, obviously, but more so emotionally.
I often rewatch that final fight.
It's so good. It is so good. I mean, to me, it is one of the best action beats ever in a sports movie, because again, it's not really about the action. The action itself, I think, is fine. It's well staged and choreographed, but man, it is the emotion, the very powerful emotion at play, the performances. Tom Hardy is so good in that movie.
I agree.
He's incredible. And how they're able to connect, and then the way the music builds too. It is so good.
I'm so good. Surprised you didn't cry more. I was really hoping for it. So I asked you to keep going, but
earlier.
yeah, okay. Fair enough. I'll quickly talk about my number one, just given the nature of this conversation. I don't want to change it too much. I'm actually surprised it didn't make your top 5, although it's probably somewhere in your top 10, at least I would think, because I know we've talked about this movie a few times on the show, or at the very least, I know Jay Ledbetter specifically has brought it up. I know he's a big fan of this movie. In fact, he was supposed to join us for this episode, which is why initially I was going to leave it off, because I knew he would probably talk about Steve James's Hoop Dreams from 1994. This documentary, this nearly 3-hour documentary documenting William Gates and Arthur Agee, 6 years of their life, if I'm not mistaken. So it almost has this this Linklater-like approach before it became a thing.
Yeah, it was Boyhood before Boyhood. Yeah,
it really was. I mean, it's half the length of Boyhood, but it still follows the same concept. But I think, despite it being a documentary, I still think it has a similar Linklater-like energy to it. At times, it doesn't even feel like a documentary. It feels like it has the propulsion of a narrative drama. And there are things that happen here narratively that you would think, kind of like your story earlier to open up this episode, JD, there are things that happen where you think that has to be a narrative fabrication. That's there just for drama. But there are actual twists here that are really jarring, really emotionally stimulating. And I think what's so great about it is something I think I mentioned earlier for a few of my other examples, is that you don't need to love the sport of basketball to love this movie. If anything, basketball is really a conduit for these two young boys trying to become men who are really just dealing with their surroundings of American prosperity. It's really a movie about American life in many ways. Inner city children in Chicago, if I'm not mistaken, and really just having this dream that they're trying to break the chains from. They have these chains they're trying to break free from for this dream of basketball, and that's really all it is. And it's so relatable. I mean, it doesn't need to be a basketball movie, but the fact that it is, I think it makes it perhaps the best sports movie ever made. And at 3 hours, it's endlessly rewatchable. Like, this is a very exciting movie, at times feeling like a coming of age film in many ways. And I do think it is quite great. I know Jay has talked about it a lot on this show many times, and I'm sure he'll be happy to hear that I'm bringing it up here yet again. But I do think Hoop Dreams is a wonderful experience.
Yeah, I formulated my list based off of, everything we said earlier in terms of, me wanting to maintain the movies that define me as a sports fan, even if that meant a little bit of crossover to the first time we did this exercise, albeit 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And also wanting to incorporate some new films. And absolutely, I anticipated that this was going to be on Jay's list. And then, of course, he wasn't here. If I was doing a true objective, these are the best sports movies ever made, then you have to make room for Hoop Dreams. Absolutely.
Yeah, you have to. Absolutely.
Yeah, I completely agree. Really great film. Honorable mentions? Or no, you haven't got to your number one yet.
No, that is my number one.
That was your number one. Oh,
yeah, yeah. Remember, we kind of went a little out of order because I wanted to see if you would keep crying after talking about Mystery Alaska. Right. So, so we got through our number ones. But yes, for honorable mentions, I do have a few here, just kind of spitballing. I guess going to the world of baseball once again. There are admittedly a few baseball movies that are blind spots for me that I know a lot of people consider to be classics. But of those that I have seen that I did consider, The Sandlot was obviously one. And I think that's another one like Field of Dreams that does have a love and appreciation for the sport. I mean, the sport in a way is kind of the main character, the history and love of it. So I love that about it. And keeping to baseball, I also do love Moneyball. I think that gets more into the political and business machinations of it in a really interesting way. So
yeah, I agree.
Definitely those were some that came to mind. A bit of a childhood favorite, keeping to the baseball theme, Rookie of the Year, I think is a really fun movie. Yeah. And it's one I loved as a kid, but I think it's also one that it kind of falls into the Mighty Ducks syndrome a little bit, the way it sort of pokes fun at the rules of the sport, but there's a tender quality that I don't think it loses that maybe the Mighty Ducks does. That movie is deliberately making fun of the sport, whereas Rookie of the Year, I still think does have an affection for it, given the Chicago setting and the Cubs lore there.
Sure.
As far as a few others, let's see, Friday Night Lights, going to the world of football, I think is quite great. Remember the Titans, also a really great one. Keeping to the basketball theme, White Men Can't Jump, I think is also really good.
Yeah.
A classic example that I know will be topping many people's lists is Martin Scorsese's Raging Bull, which I need to rewatch. It's been a while. I do really like the movie, but it's at this point now, it's not one of my favorites from Scorsese.
Same.
There are other films that I think he has that are more thematically complex. I think Raging Bull is one of those movies that sort of plays its thematic trump card pretty early and just kind of rides that for a while.
Yeah.
But I do think it's a very well-made movie and a very visceral boxing movie. So I do have that here as at least another honorable mention. And one more here is the Warren Beatty film Heaven Can Wait from 1978, which is a remake of sorts, but gets into the world of football and its retelling of this fantastical story. But it's a very sweet movie. It's a very sincere movie, even if the world of football is kind of, it's not even secondary. It's almost third to that story, which is why I at least wanted to mention it here. But even if I loved the movie enough to put it in my top 5, I couldn't do it. It doesn't feel like a real sports movie in that regard. So those are a few honorable mentions that I had.
All right, yeah. As far as some for me, I had $1 Million Baby. I mentioned that earlier. It's funny you mentioned Remember the Titans. That was on my original list.
Yeah, it was.
And
I remember that.
While it doesn't crack my list here, there are a few scenes. If we were talking favorite sports scenes, I would probably make room for Remember the Titans.
Yeah, okay.
Specifically, you make them remember forever the night they played the Titans.
Yeah.
Incredible. So good.
Yeah. And just earlier, not just the catharsis of that moment, but the way that the game is performed.
Yeah,
right? Just
it's so good.
The violent intensity that they show to the opposing team it's so cathartic.
Yeah, love it. Rush, as we talked about earlier, Rocky. Moneyball is a film that I actually revisited pretty recently, and that film, I think, ages like a fine wine. I think it's very good.
It is very good. It is very good.
Really like it a lot. Hoop Dreams, A League of Their Own. Major League I'd have on here. Cinderella Man. Cool Runnings, a fun little one from my childhood.
Okay.
I will champion that original Space Jam. I think it's good. I like it a lot. The sequel, not so much.
At least, again, despite what that movie is, the original Space Jam, it still has a love for basketball. It does speak to the childhood relationship with the sport in a very passioned way that I appreciate.
Yeah, I think it is a lot of fun. And then the last one I have on here, and I mentioned this, was this last week? I think it was on last week's show, Slapshot. Again,
you did.
I don't think that is a great movie, but it's one that I still admire and really love and have a lot of fun with.
Fair enough.
Anyway, those are our list. If you agree or disagree with us, email us InSessionFilm@gmail.com or hit us up on social media. The InSession Film Podcast is brought to you by our great friends over at First Time Watchers. On this episode, Brennan, we're about to talk about the next breakthrough star.
Yeah.
And that would be First Time Watchers if they were going to continue after episode 500, but they're not. They're going to miss that opportunity, and I'm sad for it.
I guess they don't want to break out. They don't want to break through. Fame is not their goal in this, which
Clearly.
In a way, I guess I have to, respect a little bit. And it is unfortunate that they do have a final episode in line for the near future. Well, somewhat near future as we're recording this here. But until that time, they are a podcast that does a great job reviewing movies, having a great conversation there, hosted by Tim, Walter, and Hermano. Maybe they don't want to break through the mold in the film Twitter sphere, but they know their movies, and you should check them out.
They do know their movies. On their latest episode, they talked about the 1987 classic Batteries Not Included.
Haven't seen this one.
Which I was going to say was a blind spot for me, is a blind spot for me.
Yeah, I've heard of it, though. I've at least heard of this one, and apparently this is a second time watch for these guys.
Yeah.
I think they noted that when
sense.
It certainly makes sense. This is what makes their show so interesting. They review and watch movies that are a bit obscure a lot of times. That's not their MO, but they do that a lot. They have these very specific movies that are very particular to their tastes, we'll simply
Yeah.
say.
Uh-huh.
A lot of times they come from the 80s. I'll say that too.
Sure.
But that's what's really unique about their show. They'll pick out a movie that they've never seen or maybe revisit after some time and give a real fresh perspective on it with their current mindset. They'll also discuss other movies they've caught up with lately, maybe some new movie trailers that are worth noting. So a lot of movie-related content there.
Yeah, and they give out some great recommendations at the end of their show. I would urge you to pay attention to. And overall, the show is very smart. It's mostly polished, and their batteries are not included. So with that said, Brendan, where can you find these guys on the internet?
They don't need batteries. They're able to power themselves. They are an energy source is what they are. And if you want to fuel them even further, you can check them out. You can check them out by going to firsttimewatchers.podbean.com. You can also hit them up on Twitter at First Time Watchers, as well as Instagram at First Time Watchers, spelled first, not numerical first. That's FIRST Time Watchers. And also search for them on Facebook by simply searching First Time Watchers.
And go subscribe to them on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. Be sure to leave them a review if you can. And at the end of your review, we ask that you leave a little hashtag so they know we sent you to them. And this week, let's go with the hashtag batteries included.
Okay.
Hashtag fuel source.
Fuel source. Yeah.
I like
Tim is
it.
energy. Tim is energy.
Yeah, leave them that hashtag. They'll love it. Again, go check them out. You'll love them. That's First Time Watchers. This week's episode is brought to you by the film Devotion.
Jonathan Majors, once again.
Jonathan Majors. Yeah, we're going to talk about breakthrough stars in the next segment, which is heavily inspired by Jonathan Majors, who is the leading role, the leading man, if you will, of Devotion. He's very good in the film. If you haven't seen it, please go and watch it. If you haven't seen it, or if you have, we have a wonderful opportunity for you to win a Blu-ray of Devotion.
Absolutely. We have 5 Blu-ray copies to give away for the film Devotion, which is this great epic and inspirational story based on true events of 2 heroic U.S. fighter pilots whose sacrifices made them the Navy's most celebrated wingmen during the Korean War specifically. And as I mentioned, we have 5 Blu-ray copies to give away. So all you have to do is follow us on Twitter at InSession Film. You'll soon see instructions in how you can win your Blu-ray copy of this epic film with not just Jonathan Majors, but also Glenn Powell. Yeah. You want to see them both in a movie together.
Trust me. Great. Yeah, absolutely. They're both very good. And also, underratedly, Chanda Dancy's score. It is one of the best scores from last year. Yeah. And no one is talking about except me, but I will champion it. It's great.
You stick to your guns, man.
Pun intended. Your F4U Corsair guns. I will stick to those. Absolutely. It is a good movie. All kidding aside, it is one of the best overlooked movies of last year. I really like it a lot. So this is going to be a film you'll want on Blu-ray. Follow us on social media, especially Twitter, and we'll have details on how you can win this contest. So, Devotion.
All
right, Brennan. So the next segment that we're going to do here real quickly, and this is a Jay special, so
it was his idea.
Of course, it's appropriate that he's not here for this.
Yeah.
But, he makes a really fascinating point with Jonathan Majors and the year that he's going to have this year. He is going to break through as the next big thing. And I love that for him. Jonathan Majors is a great talent, and I'm very excited to see what he has in store for us next. The MCU and outside of it. So using that as inspiration, we were going to talk about who we think might be great candidates for the next breakthrough star to have this Jonathan Majors-esque kind of run. So that is going to be the root of this conversation here, Brendan.
Yeah.
I guess I'll toss it to you first. Who comes to mind for you?
Well, I think you can start with a lot of people who are receiving recent awards consideration for a lot of movies. And I think the way we want to look at this is not just the year that they're having now, but what kind of career they had before that, if there's anything that you can research and find. I think of someone like Leonardo DiCaprio, who I think was perhaps one of the most premier and go-to breakout stars, especially of the 1990s. We always look at Titanic, but he had a great run even leading up to that maybe wasn't quite breakthrough territory.
Mhm.
So I think of maybe recently someone like Austin Butler. I would not be surprised if he is someone that will then fall into the same camp, just given the love that he's now receiving for Elvis. But I mean, people also remember he had a pretty noticeable role in something like Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But it shows his versatility as an actor.
Mhm.
So he is someone that I think will have a really interesting career for those reasons. I think he's going to take on a lot of different roles. But another one I'll mention two here just to get the ball rolling. Another one I think is going to be Paul Mescal. I think he's a huge one, not just because of After Some, but knowing what is coming up, specifically Gladiator 2.
Mhm.
I think that is yet another reason why he'll be someone that we look out for as well. But I think these are two talented actors that have such versatility and a
Mhm.
uniqueness to them, and that's something that you need to break out, because Jonathan
Yeah.
Majors, as this example kickstarting this conversation, he's never given the same performance. I mean, you look back at The Last Black
Yeah.
Man in San Francisco, which I think should have won him an Oscar. Uh, that is versatility right
Mhm.
there, and I think these examples that I just brought up here have their own version of that for sure.
Yeah. And I love how different that is, The Last Black Man in San Francisco to something like what we see in Devotion, which is much
Yeah.
more grounded, emotional, heroic. And then you think about how extremely different that is to something like He Who Remains in Loki, which is so weird
Mhm.
and out of
Mhm.
bounds. So, yeah, versatility is certainly the name of the game with Jonathan Majors. This show should also just be titled Brendan Stealing JD's Thunder,
Oh god.
because Paul Mescal was the first one I was going to bring up here. For me, that was easily the first name that came to mind.
Yeah.
And what he does in After Sun is incredible. It's somewhat similar to the Nick Nolte thing we were talking about.
Mhm.
Like it's like I feel like those kind of performances from those small indie films like that almost never get nominated, or
Mhm.
rarely. I shouldn't say never, but it wouldn't
Yeah.
have surprised anybody if he was overlooked and not nominated, despite
Yeah.
giving one of the better performances of the year. So the fact that he gets in is very exciting. You noted that he's up for Gladiator 2. I think he is very much on the verge of breaking through in a Jonathan Majors-esque way.
Mhm.
So that is very exciting. Another name that came to mind as well, and this is going to take a little bit of articulating perhaps, because this is a
Mhm.
name that has been around for a little bit, not a long time, probably since 2017, I'd say
Okay.
2017, 2018.
Okay.
He's actually been in several big movies, but in small bit parts. I am talking about Brian Tyree Henry.
Yeah. That's a good point. That's a good one. Yeah.
He has, I think, star quality talent. He has elite talent, but hasn't been able to showcase it as much.
Mhm.
Now, when you look at something like If Beale Street Could Talk and his little bit there, what we see with him on Causeway, and again, that's another performance that could have easily been overlooked. I was thrilled that he got nominated for an Oscar. When you watch him in those two movies, you see how incredible he is as an actor.
Yeah.
Now, I do not blame him at all for getting that money. Go get that paycheck. And this is my counter argument to every single thing you see on social media of, my favorite actor is going to be in the MCU. I don't have a
Mm,
problem with it. I'm sorry, Jonathan Majors, go get your money. Go get
yeah.
it.
Yeah. If
Get your money.
if it gets some more causeways or more
Yeah.
if Beale Street could talk, then
Yeah.
why not? Why not?
And Jonathan Majors, like the best actors in Hollywood, they also don't really phone it in.
Yeah.
The people might want to, because if people have it out for the MCU, they're just going to have it out for the MCU. But the truth is, the reality is, there's been some truly great performances in these Marvel movies.
Sure.
And I don't think Jonathan Majors is going to be one to just phone it in just because he's getting paid. I don't think that's in his DNA. And I think that's the case for a lot of people in the MCU.
Yeah.
So, when you're talking about these little bit roles that he's had in, Godzilla versus Kong, for example, and what is he doing? Or, in something like Eternals. And I actually think he's very good in Eternals in his little bit role there.
I agree.
Or Bullet Train. Bullet Train is such a weird, not great movie, but can be entertaining at times. Like he's one of the best things about that movie.
He is certainly the best thing about it. Yeah.
Even when he's in these, these big movies, he's doing his best, and obviously he's just there for a paycheck. But in these truly great films where he is allowed to showcase that talent, I think he's great. The problem is, and kudos to Hollywood for hiring him for all of these small little bit supporting roles. He's had kind of plenty of them, which is why, this is a little bit of, okay, he's sort of been there, but not really, because he hasn't starred in any of these movies. Not yet.
Right.
And that's ultimately my point. Yes, he's been in Godzilla versus Kong. He's been in Bullet Train. He's been in the MCU. He's never been the star in these things. And my argument here is that he should be. He should be the leading role in one of these big movies, or in so many more movies, big or small. I don't really care. He needs to be the leading guy in more movies because he's that good. And I think we're maybe on the verge of veering away from small bit part in big movie Brian Tyree Henry to I'm now the leading man. I'm now Superman in the next Superman movie kind of thing. Yeah. That's what I'm waiting for.
Yeah, I would not be surprised if that were to happen at some point soon. I don't know offhand what he has coming up in his filmography that could maybe, I guess, allude to that possibility. But as far as his talent is concerned, we know he's capable of that. With regard to Eternals, I think he's great in that movie. The argument could be made, maybe he gives the best performance in that movie. But I do think he is a wonderful actor. I mean, he's a scene stealer in The Beale Street Could Talk. That probably should have gotten him an award nomination in some way.
He's so good. Like that one scene.
It's kind of the thematic summation of the movie. Like, he's sort of the most important part in many ways. So there's definitely a lot that we're going to see from Brian Tyree Henry that we haven't seen. I cannot wait to see him in a leading role. But as far as a few others that could be the next breakout star, I do want to mention one just to get it out of the way, because I feel like it could be another one of those really obvious ones. But I'm going to say it in a way that's maybe not suggesting I think this person will be the next breakout star. And that's Jenna Ortega. The reason why I say that is because I feel like she kind of already is. Like, I feel like she's already kind of become that in some ways, with at least for the horror, subgenres, whether it be the Scream movies or with, Wednesday on Netflix, which has now become one of the most watch shows ever. So
I know I need to watch it. I feel like I'm the only one who hasn't seen that show yet.
Put it this way, as far as Tim Burton content is concerned, it's certainly some of the better stuff he's done in this current era of his string of directing jobs. I mean, it's no Big Fish, I'll say that, but it's but it's definitely better than Alice in Wonderland or Dumbo. I don't think he directs at all. He directs most of the episodes, but Jenna Ortega is really someone that's riding that wave right now. But I feel like she's already kind of past that point. Like it's almost too easy to guess someone like Jenna Ortega will be someone we talk about for a while. So I'll just throw another one out there, but I think Stephanie Sue from Everything Everywhere All
That was going to be the next one I threw out there as well.
We think alike, man. We think alike. So I'll keep it brief. I'll keep it brief and just let you bounce off what I'm about to say here. But again, much like Brian Tyree Henry, I think Stephanie Sue is someone that has leading actress potential. And also knowing that, if I'm not mistaken, she sort of reshaped the character that she was playing in Everything Everywhere All at Once through her audition. Her audition was so unique that it sort of helped rewrite the character in many ways, which shows a very unique set of confidence tactics that most actors don't have at such a young age. She's not that young in that way, but she's just getting started because we haven't really seen much from her yet. And I think we're going to see a lot more from her, especially as a leading woman. I think she has a lot of great things to offer.
And she just told a story on, was it Fallon or Kimmel? I can't really remember. It was one of the late night talk shows where she was saying that her performance, what her and the Daniels were formulating in terms of what you're talking about and how weird and how much of it was evolving on the fly, that she made them make an announcement on set when they actually got to set with everybody else, because she was going to be doing things that was so unconventional. She didn't want people to think that she was just going off script and doing whatever she wanted. It was directed that way. I thought it was a fun little story. But yeah, I mean, I'm completely with you. Like, her performance in that film demonstrates her vitality, the emotional nuances she's able to get to, and she can also play a fun baddie if needed. Like, she's very good. Got some wonderful range. I can't wait to see what she has in store. I have two other names here I wanted to drop, and the first one here is similar to Brian Tyree Henry, and that's Winston Duke. And he has a similar path. His filmography isn't quite as extensive, but you think about what he's been in terms of Black Panther, Avengers Infinity War, Endgame, and then in Wakanda Forever. He's been in 4 of the biggest Marvel movies to date.
Yeah.
And I love M'Baku. M'Baku is a lot of fun. But you see him in something like Us, and then especially 9 Days.
Yeah.
His performance in 9 Days should have been Oscar nominated. Absolutely one of the best performances of 2020. It is so good. So we haven't seen as much from him, but similarly, I was so blown away by him in 9 Days. And I think he's very good in Us as well, on the tonal end of the other end of the spectrum. But he shows so much promise that I think that star talent is there. And he actually has shown that even in Black Panther, in the Black Panther movies, right? Like, when he's on screen as M'Baku, he has a presence. And they do ask him to do a little bit more than, let's say, the small bit role that Brian Tyree Henry has in Godzilla versus Kong, which is a nothing role. Really.
You're right. Yeah, nothing.
And so we've seen the kind of charm, the kind of screen presence he can have in these Marvel movies, that if you were to put him in the leading role, can he carry a movie like that? I think absolutely.
I agree.
Absolutely.
I agree.
So he's one that I think is on the verge. Another name that came to mind for me as well. So Stephanie Sue was one that came to mind, which we just talked about. The other one for me, Thomasin McKenzie. I'm waiting for her to break through in a bigger way. Now, obviously, Leave No Trace, like in the cinephile sphere, she has broken through.
I was gonna say, it's she needs the right role to have both demographics, the film people and then the just general audiences notice her. I don't think she's quite gotten to the audience level.
She's not a household name. She isn't. As much as we as critics and cinephiles want to think that she is, because she's so great at something like Leave No Trace. And say what you will about Jojo Rabbit, but she's also very good in that film as well. She's very
good in Last Night in Soho as well. I don't love the movie, but she's good in it.
Or The Power of the Dog, like in her little role there. Like, when she is on screen, man, she is magnetic. She's charming. There's an innocence to her that I just find so engrossing. I think she has that kind of, she has that talent, and I think she has the star power is there. We just she hasn't had a chance to see it transcend into the cultural mainstream quite yet. But hopefully that is coming. I didn't get a chance to look at what her upcoming roles are. I'm not even sure what she's cast in and what's coming up, but hopefully one of these days soon she's able to kind of break through, because she has the ability. She just needs the opportunity.
I think she has the ability. I don't know what she has coming up that'll give her that chance, but I do hope that it comes. I'll throw out one last name just to round out this conversation, but I guess it is almost more like it's more of a forecasting pick, like you're doing with Thomasin McKenzie, that eventually something will come around and give this person that breakout role. And My last one here is actually I think it's Madeline Klein. Her name is. She was in Glass Onion. She played the character of Whiskey. But why I think she's going to be a breakout actress is really due to timing, because she made a splash as Whiskey. People really like that character in that movie, and she's really commanding and watchable on it. But her show Outer Banks on Netflix is just renewing its 3rd season, and the fact that people are noticing her due to Glass Onion, and with that show coming out at the same time, I think timing is going to be on her side.
Okay.
And it's a popular show, so I wouldn't be surprised if something like that were to happen too. And I'm not sure if it will, but I think the timing will be on her side for that one.
Okay. Yeah, that's very exciting. The last one I have, I actually have 2 more. One is a little unconventional, but the last name I have here, and I saved the best for last, or at least, this is a JD pick. It's a JD special, if you will. Jessie Buckley. I'm waiting for Jessie Buckley to break through.
Oh man, why didn't Chernobyl do that for her yet? She was so great.
I don't know. Well, and the thing is, like, she hasn't really done like a huge like studio film quite yet. Now, obviously, she's been given these small indie films or these smaller budget films to really showcase her talent as the lead and how she can carry a film. And even in something like Beast, which I think was one of the more underrated films of its year, she's really great.
Right.
Wild Rose, also incredible movie in my top 10 of 2018, and gives one of the best performances that year as well. I'm thinking of Ending Things. Now, that's a Charlie Kaufman film, so I understand why it's not for everybody. I loved it, and I think she's really good in that movie. She's the best thing about The Lost Daughter, I think. Maybe that's a controversial take, but I think she's the best thing of that film. Again, say what you will about Men, but she's great there. And of course, she's wonderful in Women Talking. So she's, she does nothing but give extremely phenomenal performances, but she hasn't been in a big film to really make it into the mainstream. But what she has shown is that she can carry a film. The talent is there. The charisma is there. The charm is there. I think she could have a very similar career as someone like Saoirse Ronan. And
with that slow build, making its way. And it won't be one specific film that does it. It'll be all of these films compounding to sort of escalate that trajectory. Because if a movie like Wild Rose got the right distribution that it needed, that would have probably been the breakout role. It would have. It has that vibe to it. It's just such a crowd pleaser in that regard. It's kind of a sports movie for country music in Scotland. It's sort of what it is. It has that same formula, but I think you're right. Comparing her to Saoirse Ronan as far as that trajectory is concerned, I think could be the case for Jessie Buckley.
Yeah, and to those that are looking at her IMDb and going, "Hey, she was in the Doolittle movie." Exactly my point. Nobody saw that film.
She's also in Judy, wasn't she? The Renee Zellweger film?
But in a small little role though in that film. So I understand why no one would be talking about her. Like in terms of that film, she's not going to be first on the list, and I understand that. But in terms of these other performances that we're talking about and how she can, like, she has star quality. Absolutely. It was written all over. She just needs the opportunity to break through into the mainstream. She needs that Jonathan Majors kind of opportunity. Hopefully it's coming. And similar to what we were saying with like Saoirse Ronan, it might not be like with Jonathan Majors, he's jumping into Creed and into the MCU. It might not be that. It just could be like a series of, like Saoirse Ronan gets nominated for Brooklyn, and then she's in for Little Women, and like and those are 2 films that did very well in their years. I think she just needs to find herself as the lead in movies that break through into the award season in a big way, and has, gets nominated and can be everywhere like a Stephanie Sue, if you will. She just hasn't.
She hasn't quite gotten that right distribution yet, which I think she should have. I mentioned Wild Rose earlier.
Wild Rose should have been. That should have been the movie.
That is a star-making movie. Whether you like the movie or not, you can't argue that it's a star-making type of role. Like, that's almost like what it was designed to be. And I think it could have easily been that if more people saw it.
I agree. Anyway, let us know. Oh, actually, before we get to the poll, I have one other name I wanted to throw out here real fast. I almost forgot.
Okay.
Now this isn't an actor or an actress, so this is a slight detour, but I'm thinking along the same path here.
Okay.
And I'm only bringing up this name because there was news recently that he was directing, or he's going to be directing some Star Wars episodes. Kogonada. I'm curious. Because, man, his two movies have been elite. They have been incredible. So good. What does he do? What can he bring to something like Star Wars? I hope he brings
Kogonada-isms to it, because he's directing episodes of The Acolyte, if I'm not mistaken, which I think is being marketed by Lucasfilm as being perhaps the most obscure thing that Star Wars content is giving us in the next few years. Which, sign me up for that. But I mean, I hope he's able to channel his own sensibilities and not play a game, if that makes sense. But I think his sensibilities were certainly, they don't feel like Star Wars, which is what makes me excited for it.
Well, I mean, we joked about this on the show as soon as last year, I think. Of like, we're heading in a direction in Hollywood where eventually we're going to get Terrence Malick Star Wars movies. Like that's kind of where, the studio.
I'll still be surprised if that ever happens, but I'll be slightly less surprised than I was maybe a year ago.
Like I would love a Terrence Malick Star Wars movie. That would be incredible. Even if they just made it for us.
It'll be Luke Skywalker contemplating the faith of the Jedi.
He would, and as a person of faith, or as someone who explores faith in his movies a lot, Terrence Malick is somewhat tailor-made for that. All kidding aside,
it is. I mean, the Force itself is a religion. I mean,
it is. Yeah.
I mean, it channels ancient Buddhism in many ways. So, I mean, it is
it's right there. I'm just saying.
He twist it in maybe a more Christian-like way. He can certainly talk about doubt and religious doubt in the way that he's done before.
It's there.
Yeah,
Terry, if you're listening, do this.
Make a Star Wars movie.
I think I would love it.
Anyway, just Luke Skywalker in the desert, like just wandering around.
Oh, I would love that. Just the camera wandering off to the left,
fluttering behind him.
These animals around. Oh man, I want that so bad. Anyway, I bring that up to say that Kogonada entering into Star Wars is the closest thing to that's actually happening. So
yeah.
Because to your point, I hope that it is whatever he directs, whatever episodes they are, that it is very Kogonada and less Star Warsy.
Agreed.
So I mean, there's some fun potential there, and if that does well. However Disney defines that, maybe they give Kogonada something else, an actual movie or a different property, and maybe he breaks through into the mainstream as a director in some way, shape, or form. Whatever that looks like, I'd be curious.
I would be surprised if he gets a full movie. I think getting a director like him for a few episodes of a television show that's meant to be a bit more daring is really the best way to test the water like that. But I, at this point now, I mean, if it's really successful and his name becomes attached to the Acolyte, that people start to recognize him in that regard, then maybe it will happen. But at this point, I'd be surprised if he gets a movie. But
that's why I throw out the caveat if it does well. Because obviously it has to succeed first.
It has to. Yeah, you're right.
But assuming it does well, maybe they offer him something else, something that carries a little bit more weight. So,
it'd be interesting.
At any rate, let's talk about this week's poll.
It's real bad, okay? I don't like those numbers at all.
Just one poll. Those things aren't scientific.
Yes, they are. All this is science. This is math.
All right, so this week's poll, inspired by Creed 3, we asked all of you, what is your favorite Rocky sequel, specifically Rocky? We're not including Creed 2 or Creed 3 in this poll, just the Rocky films themselves. And we actually asked this one on Twitter because we realized there's really only 4 films to pick from. Technically, there are 5 films, but we erased Rocky 5 from that list. And that's not even just the way we feel about it, that we thought it shouldn't even be included. We know Sly Stallone himself doesn't even want to consider that movie. The latest Blu-ray 4K box set of Rocky doesn't even include Rocky 5.
It just doesn't exist.
It just does not exist. I think that's we could have a full discussion about Rocky 5, JD. It's a fascinating movie to talk about. It's not a great movie, but there are things that it's doing that I think are at least interesting. But with regard to this week's poll, the options obviously include Rockies 2, 3, 4, and Balboa, which is technically Rocky 6. Winning the poll at 42%, though, and we got almost 150 votes here, so it was a pretty competitive poll. But winning at 42% was Rocky 4. So I guess ending the Cold War in Russia is enough to grant you a victory here.
Yeah.
I'm not too surprised by that. It makes me wonder.
Either.
Yeah, but it makes me wonder if the votes there for Rocky 4 from 1985, or maybe the rejuvenated love for it, given the director's cut that came out about a year ago, I think, called Rocky versus Drago, which is a really interesting re-edit of the film. So maybe the fact that both of those now exist could be what's driving it too. But I know Rocky 4 has such a cultural it's just like it's part of the 80s zeitgeist, right? Like it's kind of that thing. So I'm not surprised to see it win. Rocky Balboa comes in second place though at 25%, which I believe is your favorite of the Rocky sequels, JD. I believe that's what you said.
Yeah, I like Rocky Balboa quite a bit. It's, and I think for me it just comes down to, again, the characterization and the emotion at the center of that film. It just hits a little harder than what the other sequels are trying to do. And obviously the other sequels they're certainly aiming to be a little bit more bombastic, maybe a little bit silly.
Yeah.
And I understand why people love Rocky 4 in that regard. And I just love the tonal disparity in something like Rocky Balboa. I don't think it's entirely successful, but of the sequels, I think it is my favorite. I enjoy 2, 3, and 4 as well. The only one I straight out don't like is 5, but as we noted, that doesn't exist. So of the actual sequels, Balboa has just a little bit extra there for me that I love. And Stallone is very good in that film.
Maybe the first real true Lego sequel in some ways. I mean, it kind of does predate that whole. It kind of does. Yeah. And I feel like Creed doesn't come out because of the way Rocky Balboa was actually made. Like it does what Rocky 5 tried to do and go back to the streets of Rocky. Yeah. And I think Rocky Balboa certainly does it more successfully. My favorite of the Rocky sequels is actually the one that came in third place at 18%, and that's Rocky 3. And I think it's because, well, a couple of reasons. I think it's the one that's the best mesh of the visceral and human qualities of Rocky with the bombacity and cartoonishness that it would eventually become. I think the merriment there is actually really good and quite seamless. But it's also one that I'm not sure if this was intentional, but there's a meta quality to that film that I find really interesting because it seems to exist in this world between Rocky the man, but also Rocky the film franchise. Like it's kind of like the Rocky the film franchise is almost a character in the movie. Like it's almost commenting on the commercialization of the franchise by using that sense of commercializing with Rocky Balboa's own success as a boxer.
Sure.
There's a merriment there that I find interesting, which is what kind of makes Clubber Lang, as cartoonish as he is, a fascinating bad guy, given the fact that he had to work so hard for his achievement for fame and came from nothing. But here's Rocky doing the exact opposite. So the dynamic there is really good. And I love the dynamic between Carl Weathers and Sly Stallone in the back half.
Sure.
So that one I think is quite great. That one I think has aged very well, if I do say so myself.
Yeah, very good. It's one I like as well. Thanks to everyone that voted on the poll. Really, really do appreciate it.
Yeah.
As we wind things down here a little bit, a couple of plugs. One, next week on the show, we're going to be talking about the Oscars. We are one week
celebration
away from the Oscars, which finally, this couldn't have come soon enough.
It end.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. They just got to rip off the Band-Aid. I think we already know who's going to win Best Picture. Let's just get it over with.
Yep.
so we can move on with 2023. But we'll have some sort of post-Oscars reaction show next week. We already have a review of Creed 3 up that you can go and check out. We also started our Wong Kar-wai movie series, Ryan and Jay, on that first episode, talking about his debut film, As Tears Go By. And that is a film that I also really liked. I was hoping we'd have time for me to talk about it, but we're getting low on time, so I'll go ahead and wait for another time. But that is a movie that I really like, and I think Ryan and Jay did a great job of breaking that one down. And then, of course, we'll have a review for Scream 6 coming soon, so you can be on the lookout for that. And also, Women in Session, their latest episode is up. They talked about their least favorite Best Picture nominees. Some doozies on there. I certainly didn't agree with everything they had to say as usual, but a fun conversation. Definitely urge people to go and check that out. And of course, follow us on social media, subscribe here on YouTube or on your favorite podcast app of choice. Leave us those reviews. Hit us up on Patreon, patreon.com/InSessionFilm. That is a great way to get a hold of us as well. Brendan, any final thought before we get out of here real quick?
Well, I know we have some happy music playing, but I did at least want to address, I miss Tom Sizemore already. The passing of Tom Sizemore was certainly unfortunate. First thing I saw in them was a movie called Heart and Souls with Robert Downey Jr. It's an interesting movie. I think it was in 1993, but he certainly made an impression, even in the small roles he was in with movies like Saving Private Ryan and Heat as well. So certainly a talent that we lost too soon at age 61.
Yeah, absolutely. Rest in peace, Tom Sizemore. Really great actor. Certainly will be missed. That is for sure. Hopefully you all enjoyed sports movies and next Breakthrough Star. And we'll get to the Oscars next week. So we'll see you all next time on the InSession Film Podcast. Warrior is great. I'm unashamed of my tears.
It is great. But I wish there were more tears. Why weren't there more?
I needed more.
So just, we'll wait till Andrew is born. All of a sudden you'll cry twice as hard now.